Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero. And on this week's episode, we are talking about overcoming learned helplessness for a happier life. And joining us in the virtual studio today is Dr. Jared C. Pistoia. Jared is a licensed naturopathic physician and the author of 2 books. He is also the legislative chair of the Connecticut Naturopathic Physicians Association, where he works to advance naturopathic medicine. He's published dozens of wellness articles for Healthline.com, and his first involvement in health began over 15 years ago when he studied nutrition and exercise before working as a personal trainer, health coach, and nutritionist. Welcome to the show, Jared.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us on your, I think, Sunday evening.
Yes, it is a Sunday evening, and it's definitely past my wind down time. Not quite my bedtime yet, but this is wind down time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for making the time to join the show at such a late hour. And I think it was interesting at the beginning of the conversation. I have to share this with our audience when we were talking about naturopathy and, you know, the fact that it's such a new thing for me personally. And so even though it's not included in the title of the episode, I have to begin by saying that, you know, today's conversation is going to be based on naturopathy quite a bit. And that is your professional background. And this is my first time hearing about it. I was doing some Googling before we started. And I was like, oh, this is like a completely new space. I had no idea it existed until today. And so I would love for you to share a bit more about this space with our audience, and especially, you know, about the reason why you chose to be in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Naturopathy is my life. You know, it's part of who I am, part of my identity. And I didn't really discover that until my late 20s. So I'll start by describing what it is. So it's really a distinct primary healthcare profession that uses natural therapies and natural substances, for example, botanicals and homeopathic medicines, nutrition, lifestyle adjustments. And the idea is that these encourage an individual's inherent self-healing processes. So within each of us is the ability to heal. And we can see that when we cut our finger, it just magically heals itself after some time. So the aim of naturopathy is not only to stimulate those self-healing mechanisms, but also to restore health in the process. And the practice of naturopathic medicine also includes traditional or historical approaches to medicine, in addition to research-backed science. So it's a bit of a combination between traditional medicines and what we know today from scientific observation and the scientific method. So I didn't really know anything about naturopathy until I was applying for medical schools, and I didn't want to prescribe drugs. So the natural next question was, well, what the heck am I going to do? And so I found originally osteopathic medicine, which takes more of a vantage point of the spine and the health of the spine. And actually chiropractic medicine is a bit of a branch off of that. But osteopathic medicine was around during the origins of naturopathic medicine. And I first found that and then applied to some DO schools, that's the credential, and realized that I really was more aligned with naturopathic philosophy after doing also some Google searching. So it was exciting to learn about how you could really change people's lifestyles or help them change their lifestyles. And as an effect of that, allow them to become healthier. And the body really does respond in a very powerful way when you make these changes, these simple changes, even just doing something like exercising more. And we all can attest to that, I think. So that's sort of how I began with it. It's just sort of wanted to be a doctor, didn't want to prescribe drugs, and was searching for what the next best thing could be that's close to that.
Thank you for sharing that, Jared. It's definitely very fascinating for me personally, at least, because as I mentioned to you, this is such a new thing to me, but in a way, it makes a lot of sense why and how this came to be, and especially for you, why you chose it as a career path. I think we do need more of that. Not to say that medicines are not important, but I think understanding how to heal ourselves using the tools that we all have, that's the most basic thing that I guess a lot of us don't know how to do. And you were kind of saying to me, lots of your patients ask you questions about naturopathy, right? So I'm just sort of as curious as your next patient about this whole process, because it sounds like something that could have helped us a long time ago if we had known about it, I guess. So we'll find out more about that in today's topic soon. Before we get there, we've got a section we called Have You Met Jared? We're going to get to know you a bit better through some of your favorite things. So first of all, I would love to know what your favorite book is.
My favorite book at the moment, and maybe all time, I don't know yet, but it's a book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello. And the reason I like that book is because it's about spirituality and what that really means. And there's a lot of tools and perspectives in that book that helped me really change my life and change my perspectives in a way that was very freeing. And I think it's a book that everyone should read because it offers such a different perspective on life and what spirituality means. So it's a book that I frequently revisit too, if I get caught up in cycles.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, as our audience know, we don't really publish these podcasts in real time. So fun fact is earlier today, we actually just recorded an episode on beauty and spirituality. So this book is quite on theme with our podcast schedule today, which is fascinating. And thank you for sharing that. And what about a movie you've enjoyed recently?
Recently, I watched The Equalizer. It's not a really, philosophical movie, but it's a good one, entertaining. Denzel Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a new one for me. I've never seen it or heard of it, so that's a new one. What about podcasting? So you're our podcast guest today, and fun fact on this show, which I mention all the time, is some of our podcast guests actually don't listen to podcasts at all. What about yourself?
Yeah, I'm kind of one of those people. I do more recording and speaking than I do listening. I have listened to some podcasts in the past. The Joe Rogan, obviously, pretty much everyone knows that podcast. I caught some of the Elon Musk interviews on there, but at this point in my life, I'm more about getting my message out there. And I don't like really the podcasts tend to drag on, and you wind up picking up a few good points, and it's like a 3-hour thing. It's like,
That's beautiful. And that's a good point. We'll try to keep this succinct as much as we can and not go on about 3 hours. So thank you for sharing that. What about your role model in life, if you have one or maybe multiple?
Yeah, I was listening to the podcast that was just published, the latest one on Spotify. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he gave the same answer that I'm going to give. Is I don't have any real role models at the moment. And I kind of feel like, oh, maybe I should have role models, but I like to find my own way in the world, my own way through life. And there are people who inspire me. Everybody in some way inspires me because they're doing something that's different than I am. And for me, that's inspirational. And seeing those different perspectives allows me to continue growing as a person. But I don't really aspire to be like anyone in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I think after asking this question about, I think 100 times now on this show, I probably want to change the question eventually to, which traits from whom do you aspire to, do you, just look up to or learn from? Because that's true. We don't really need to aspire to be like anybody else, right? That defeats the whole purpose of living. So totally agree with you there. So finally, in this part, let's talk about a course that you've taken in your life that has really inspired you to this day.
I would say the main course was probably the history and philosophy of naturopathic medicine. And because that really opened my mind to what can be done in terms of healing and in terms of both physical illness and mental illness. So there's these just basic principles of healing in life that I learned about, and the history of medicine in America, and how sort of everything became what it is today. So it really opened my mind to a lot of different perspectives about life.
Thank you for sharing that, and very on brand, right? Just exactly what you're doing professionally, and I love hearing that when people talk about the actual course or the whole degree that they were doing that inspired them. Like, I think it's just rare, and really love hearing that from our guest. So thanks for sharing. So now we've got to know you a little bit better, Jared, and let's talk about today's topic of overcoming learned helplessness for a happier life. Before we start talking about naturopathy and overcoming learned helplessness, let's talk about happiness because that's what we're here to talk about. So happiness has a variety of different definitions because each person has a unique perspective on it. So I wonder what your perspective is.
Yeah, so I just published the book on joy. And in some of that book, it discusses the difference briefly between happiness and joy. So the book is called Pocketful of Sunshine, How to Cultivate Joy When You Feel Depressed. And so early in the book, I kind of talk about what's the difference, right? We hear happiness, we hear joy. Is there actually a difference between the two? So I think happiness is more of the acute state of, I have a lollipop and I'm happy, pretend I'm a child. Or as an adult, I have some comfort food that makes me happy. But what is joy? Joy is more of a sustained state of happiness. It's more of a perspective, as I describe it, more of a state of being, something that we can practice and cultivate. So happiness is more the acute, and I think joy is more of the a mindset. That's something that you can cultivate and sort of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a new perspective. I think we've covered the topic of joy on this podcast before. And when we talked about joy the last time, I remember it's kind of there was an emphasis on the relationship between joy and happiness. It's quite similar to what you're describing. But since we want to focus a bit more on happiness, I want to dig a little bit deeper. So you kind of saying, there's a state there, and there's more like a mindset between one is happiness, the other one is joy. So if we talk about the state of happiness or being happy, um, each of us sees it very differently, and that leads us to sort of have different ways of seeing it in the wrong sense. Like, for example, being happy, some people will see it not as something that should be temporary, like a state, like what you just described. They might view it as something that they need to be all the time, which is one of the key misconceptions that we've debunked on this show. So I wonder if you have something else as a misconception about happiness that you would like to debunk today.
Sure. And I'm sure that it came up on one of the episodes, but I think the number one biggest misconception is that happiness is external or comes from an external source, or that it depends on other people, right? Just to elaborate, or on a circumstance, on a life event, that you're going to get a better job or get higher income. And it's just not true. And I think anyone who's ever accomplished anything knows that they've accomplished something, and yes, they felt maybe some happiness, right, in that instance, but it wasn't something that was really lasting. And I think also what they may have realized is that the reason they felt happy is because they themselves had come to a conclusion that this brought them happiness. And so they sort of generated it within themselves. And I think that's when you can wrap your mind around having an internal source of happiness rather than having to do something to go and get it, then I think that you can access happiness whenever you want. It becomes a choice, something that's self-generated. And you can choose it every day if you want to. And I think that's part of my message, is that it's a choice.
Yeah, I love that message. It is a choice. I guess, in the context of today's day and age, we get a lot of different kinds of messages about happiness and the external sources of happiness, which is kind of in alignment with some other misconceptions that other guests have brought up. Like, you need to accumulate more wealth to be happy. You need to accumulate more stuff to be happy, which is completely wrong. And I think that the choice part is extra important in the sense that you can be going through something really tough. And, most of us will agree that at one point or another in our lives, that's what happened. But we can still have that choice to be happy if we look at what we do have or what we can appreciate or learn from the situation, which is kind of similar to what we're going to touch on in a little bit in this conversation, because we want to talk about learned helplessness. actually another terminology that I just learned about in preparation for this podcast. I didn't really pay attention to that. But when I was looking it up and, think about it in the context of happiness, I thought, this is actually fascinating because according to the definition in psychology, it was kind of saying that it's a state that occurs, and this is what I just noted down. It's a state that occurs after a person has experienced a stressful situation repeatedly. They believe that they are unable to control or change the situation, so they do not try, even when opportunities for change are available. And that is in alignment with what you just said, actually, because in those situations, we have a choice. We can choose to, rise above the situation and choose happiness, even though it sounds a bit cliche. But in reality, I think it will work out if we understand and break it down into components. And today we're going to talk about that. So it is a nice segue for me to ask you about this concept of learned helplessness. And there are also situational challenges. So slightly different, a little bit more temporary compared to this state of learned helplessness that gets described. So what do you think to be the key differences between learned helplessness and situational challenges?
Well, the key difference is how you respond to a challenge. So if you respond in a way that is sort of this victim mentality where you're powerless, you're helpless, you're trapped, you don't know how to get out of a situation, and so you just sort of kind of sit there and say, somebody help me, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm trapped, I can't get out of here. That's different from someone who says, this situation is challenging, and what's the solution? How do I get out of here? And there's the choice. That's the choice that you're making is, okay, I'm going to look for ways to get out of this situation. And I think that really defines the difference between learned helplessness and some other mindset that's not learned helplessness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think the word choice there is the emphasis in this scenario, I think. And how do you think learned helplessness would impact our happiness in life, since we're talking about happiness?
It will make a huge difference in your ability to feel happiness and to go take it a step further and feel a sustained state of happiness, right? Joy. Because even when you're in a situation where you perceive it to be something that's going to bring you unhappiness, that's your perception, right? That's your choice to perceive it that way. You can be in a situation that from the outside looking in is neutral, but to you, it seems like it's something that would bring me unhappiness, or this was something that would be challenging for me and difficult for me to get out of. Well, not really, not necessarily, right? That might just mean that you have to try new things and do something different. And so I think if you can adopt the mindset of looking for happiness, no matter what situation that you're in, then I think that you'll find that life can be a lot more happy for you and that you're not a subject to the external circumstance, to the external environment. And that's what originally the definition of learned helplessness was about. So there was a theory that was put forth in the 1960s by a couple of psychologists. They did some experiments with dogs, 3 groups of dogs. And I'll just briefly go into that experiment to tell you where it came from. So there was 3 groups of dogs. One of them was a control. So I'll just talk about the main 2, the experimental groups. So one of the groups of dogs received these electric shocks. They were mild shocks. The dogs didn't get hurt, but they were able to move a lever that would turn the shocks off. So, some of them figured out how to do that. There was a second group that would receive a shock every time the first group did, but they had no access to a lever to stop it. So they had no way of controlling anything. So then there was a second part of the experiment where the dogs from both groups were shocked again, but this time they had the option to jump over a partition and escape the whole area. So there'd be no more shocks. So now the interesting thing was that only the dogs from the group that had access to that lever originally had jumped over that partition. The other group made no attempt at escaping. So they just assumed, I'm a victim of the circumstances here, even though there's actually a way out of here. You could just jump over the partition. They didn't even try to do that. Didn't even look for the partition, I suppose. So they kind of concluded that originally that it was a learned sort of helplessness. Like, okay, there was no way that they could control the exposure they were getting to those shocks originally. So even when the circumstance changed, they still didn't make any effort to leave the circumstance or change it. So what's interesting is that it became kind of a misnomer, learned helplessness, because they changed their conclusion after that to psychologists. So rather than the dogs had learned helplessness, what they decided on was that a helpless behavior was actually a default reaction to a prolonged stress. And so basically they failed to learn how to get out of the situation. They didn't learn helplessness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I'm just kind of cringing a little bit thinking about the dogs being experimented
I
on. not really that ethical, but
yeah.
that's a side discussion for another day.
It was the 60s.
Yeah, it was.
All kinds
so
of crazy
hopefully,
stuff.
that's not happening anywhere nowadays. But coming back to the point of this whole experiment, I think that is interesting because we can learn from that when we look at it from the outside. And, when we learn about this whole experiment, but life is different from experiments, right? And sometimes we don't know what exactly is happening. So I think if we were to put ourselves into the shoes of the test subjects in this scenario, sometimes we go through things like that in life. And I think what this experiment was telling me was kind of similar to that situational challenges versus learned helplessness that's kind of prolonged. And it's interesting because today we're talking about this new concept that you just explained at the beginning, naturopathy. And based on everything that we just learned, plus the fact that there's this new concept being dropped on us today, naturopathy, how do you think this can actually help us to change the way that we see situations, challenges, learned helplessness? How can we approach life a little bit differently thanks to naturopathy?
So what I like about naturopathic medicine is that it's really not so much about health. It's more about life and how life works, because we're inseparable from the way that life works. And that includes the way that our health works and the way that disease starts. So if you can understand more about life, then you can gain a greater understanding about health in general. There are these fundamental rules, or we may call them laws, about how things work in the world. Just throw a general term out there. It really comes down to physics and these physical concepts that we're still kind of trying to figure out and learning that, okay, there's a lot more to the world than we think or thought there was. And so naturopathy is really an effort to understand how everything works together. And when you can really gain that understanding, your health will improve. That's the bottom line with that. So one of the other things I like about naturopathy is that there's an emphasis on psychology and helping people to look at life differently. And that's where you can start making changes, because when you have a different perspective, it's like looking at a microscope through a different lens, something that is, let's just use like a 10x magnification. Not that close in, you'll see some things. And somebody came in and brought you a 100x, that's 10 times more. You're going to see something completely different. And having those two viewpoints is going to allow you to have a more rounded approach, a more rounded perspective about what life actually is. So all of these different viewpoints, all these different ways of looking at things will help you to understand and react to situations differently than if you just had one way of doing things or no way of doing things, right? In the case of learned helplessness, there's no way of sort of trying to get out of that situation. No attempt is made. So I think that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to go into a bit more detail, but just to kind of focus on what you just said there, I started thinking about this similar perspective of, when you're zooming out of the situation, you look at it from above as a whole. Like, this is the overall situation, this is what you're encountering, and then you can break it down into the day-to-day challenges. Now, depending on whatever an audience member might be going through, it might be something that has been going on for years. So the overall overarching problem might be something that they don't necessarily see, but they could see what's going on their day-to-day life and how that's affecting them. So I like that analogy of the lens and the zoom lens as well. But if we were to go into a bit more detail, right? Because as I mentioned to you, naturopathy is such a new thing for me and probably for some or most of the audience member tuning into this podcast. probably didn't expect that to be on this podcast about learned helplessness. How does that work in reality? So let's just say, a patient comes to you with a certain set of problems, and you're helping them to address it with naturopathy. Maybe you can help us by giving us some example of some of the problems that they tend to encounter. Maybe it could be related to learned helplessness and how naturopathy can help them to address it.
Yeah, I think if I can use just sort of a lighter example would be, let's say I'm seeing a student and they're under a lot of stress. They're in a graduate program or something, and they have great academic aptitude, right? So they have the ability to perform well in school. They've done it their whole life, but now they're in a class and the class is very difficult. And so maybe this person has a bit of learned helplessness behavior. So they're in this very challenging class, and something they might say after they, failed their first exam is, "Oh, the professor is no good. They're not a good teacher, and because of that, I'm doing very poorly in the class." And you say, "Okay, well, maybe that's the case." And you look, maybe see how everyone else is doing. Maybe some other people aren't doing very well either. Maybe some people are doing really well, right? So this person, let's come back to this person who has great academic aptitude, but reaches this challenging class and decides that this is not my fault, the professor is no good, and that's their viewpoint. So what are they going to become in that situation? They become a victim, right? A victim of circumstance. That's a learned helplessness behavior, or perspective, I should say. So what defines that person's interaction with reality then is the choice that they make from either determining, okay, I'm going to be stuck in here, I'm a victim, or how can I get out of this? How can I make my grades better? How can I improve my grades on these tests? What do I have to do to learn and get through this class? Even just asking that question will help that person. So there could be an infinite number of things that person can do to get themselves through that class, right? They could go talk to other students. They could talk to the professor. They could go on YouTube. They could do all these things, go get extra help to try and get themselves through that class and into a more solutions-focused mindset. So somebody that came in to my office, for example, in that same exact situation, they're getting all this stress from this class, I could just say, well, what choices are you making? Because if you're just choosing to throw your hands up and blame it on the teacher, well, then you're not really learning anything. You're just sort of submitting to the idea of being a victim. And that's not empowering. That's the opposite of empowering, right? And being empowered is being in a healthy state. And that's one that is going to actually build momentum for yourself too, because every time you face a challenge, they're going to say, I know that there's a way out of this. Okay, let me start looking for the ways out of this rather than looking for the ways to stay trapped. And that's where perspective comes in. And I think learned helplessness is, in relationship to perspective, is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'm a completely newbie to this naturopath space, but I want to ask you a question because it sounds to me like what you were doing there is very similar to either coaching or therapy. Would that be a fair description of that?
It's definitely a fair description. The main difference is I'm not using any, clinical didactic tools from psychology or from some other discipline study. It's really just about trying to share a perspective that enables them to access a better state of health. And so I think that is one of the first things, is that you can be empowered if you want to be, right? And I'm going to keep bringing it back to choice, because to me, everything's a choice. Your perspectives are a choice, and your perspectives enable feelings, and they also result in actions. And that's how we create our realities. Yep. So it is kind of a form of what I call naturopathic counseling.
Yes, counseling. Yeah, that too. Another stream that I thought was very similar. And I think you have a very impressive background with a lot of different things that has to do with, just making that choice. Because when I introduced you at the beginning, I remember there was a part that talked about how you began working as a personal trainer, health coach, and nutritionist. So I'm guessing a lot of this is kind of playing into naturopathy as part of your work now, and because of this background, you have even more tools to suggest and recommend to your patients. But in this scenario, if we're talking about learned helplessness, I guess when you're talking about, that choice and sense of empowerment, it sounds like we're talking about self-efficacy. And, for a lot of people, if they're going through a tough time and, same thing keeps happening and they're kind of thinking, okay, I'm this victim of my situation or whatever's going on in my life. There's no sense of self-efficacy, I guess. And so if that is happening to a particular patient or someone who's coming to this podcast just kind of trying to find a way out, what other tools can you recommend to them based on your background?
Well, first of all, I want to say I don't want to invalidate anyone's experience of what they're going through. And, some people might get offended by being labeled as a victim. And I think that there's a certain truth in whether or not you're a victim or someone who's empowered. And I think if it's something that you're offended by or you feel triggered by it, there's something there, right? Something there for you to look into. And I think if you look into that, you'll learn something about yourself. I don't know what you'll learn, but you'll learn something. So I always emphasize personal responsibility with my patients. That is the number one thing when it comes to psychology, and something like learned helplessness is personal responsibility. You have to take responsibility for your life. And if you can't do that, you're always going to be blaming things on somebody else, or you're going to be the subject of somebody else's actions. And I think you can do whatever you want to do. You can see life however you want to see it. It's completely up to you. And there's a nice creative energy that comes with that sort of belief system and that sort of way of being. And it's also a very individualistic energy that will come because it's your own flavor of things. So when you take personal responsibility for things, it enables you to start seeing the choices that you're making. Now, the natural question that somebody might ask is, well, I went through this trauma when I was, 3 years old or 10 years old when it was out of my control. And so, there's nothing that I can do because this trauma is just imprinted on me. And yes, there's a certain degree of truth in that, right? Because you couldn't make choices at that young of an age about these impactful life events. And so they molded you into looking at the world in a certain way. And that's really the part of the heart of learned helplessness is it was learned, right? And it was often learned when you couldn't really learn something else instead of that because you didn't have a choice. But now you have a choice. And that's what I come back to with people is, yes, you went through something difficult, and I did too. I went through difficult life events too. But I made a choice based on what I know, how I want to feel today, not how I was conditioned to feel. That's a huge difference in finding a state of health, is being able to differentiate between that you're making a choice now based on information that's no longer relevant to you because the past is not real anymore. So even though you're having effects from it still, how do you get out of that? Well, you start thinking differently. And that begins with taking responsibility for all those thoughts that you're still having. And you don't have to be hard on yourself about it, right? I was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. I was 10. Well, you didn't know any better, right? So the only thing that's real now is the present. And every moment that we're alive, it's that same one moment that's going on. And we're making a choice in every single moment to see the world in a certain way. And when you decide that you want to see the world in a different way, then you start to see the world in a different way, according to your choice. It's really that simple. And some people might think it's cliche, and then some of the cliches are true, though. It's just that when you don't actually adopt them, you won't see what their value is. So personal responsibility, that's where I come back to with people. Mm-hmm. It's empowering.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. Some people definitely have it a bit harder to untangle, especially when it comes to trauma and other issues that, have sort of bigger implications on their lives. And I think this sense of choice is something that we need to also be a little bit more careful when we talk about this. This fact that you can choose to do better. You can choose to get out of this situation. Only because for some people, I have found that we can see that, right? Outside looking in, we can see that, okay, you have this choice to change the situation, to do better. But if we don't approach it in the right way, it can break them. And that's at least what I've learned through, conversation with friends and, loved ones. Sometimes we see the choice and the change really clearly. It's really simple. This is all they need to do. And we think that why is it so hard for them to see when it's so simple? And I guess that is probably part of that learned helplessness and its impact on their happiness, because they're in such a dark space that it's hard for them to see what exactly they can do. So my question to you is, let's just say, they don't have access to naturopathy or, physicians like yourselves, or even support. And somebody wants to help, like let's say a friend or a family member is listening to this podcast and wants to help somebody else. How should we go about approaching this conversation of sending this message about choice to say that, hey, you have a choice, but in a way that would be okay for that person to take?
Gotcha. So I think we should also tell people that you can choose to do nothing too, right? You can choose to be where you are and stay where you are, and that's totally fine. That's acceptable. There's no better way of doing things really, because people are going through life and learning things based on the circumstances that they're in. And so they may be actually learning a profound lesson by, let's just say as an example, staying in a toxic relationship, right? That's like the big thing with a lot of people, is that they'll stay in these relationships and the relationship is clearly not benefiting them anymore in any obvious way, but they're staying in it. They're making a choice to stay in it, right? But they can also be still learning about themselves by making that choice. And so that is, I think, part of the reason why people actually stay in those relationships, because they're still learning something, or they may be getting to the point of learning something profound, right? Which may just for that person be standing up for themselves and saying, that's it, this is not working for me anymore, I'm done. But to help somebody, if someone is in a certain circumstance, a family member, and you would like to help them, I think the best thing you can do is talk to them about and try to understand what their motivations are. Because you can sort of create a little bit of dissonance in somebody's mind, the cognitive dissonance about, what do you want out of this? Let's just say it's a relationship. What are you looking for in a relationship, and what are you getting in the one that you're in? And they might start to answer those two questions differently, right? They say they want to feel safe and secure in a relationship, or they want someone that they could be with for the rest of their life, who's going to be supportive and loving. And then say, okay, well, how is your current partner? And then they're going to answer something completely different. And then there's that little moment of, okay, there's something completely different here. So naturally, what are we going to do with that? What's called cognitive dissonance, right? That's what I'm trying to create by asking them that question, so that they say, wait a minute, there's something that's not in alignment here. And how do I resolve that? So I think just by asking those questions and stimulating them to try and understand what's motivating them, it might provide them the stimulus to start looking at themselves a little bit more objectively and saying, okay, I'm in this situation. It's not what I want to be in, really. Why am I in it? And then when they finally get to that point of why am I in it, that's when they start learning about themselves. And that's when they may start to see that, that trauma when I was 8 years old with whoever is still motivating the decisions that I'm making today. And it's leading to outcomes that I don't prefer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes the best thing we can do for people is to let them learn the lessons themselves. But if they repeatedly choose to not learn, then that sense of learned helplessness is going to just stick around. And I guess that's the toughest part, right? Because you can tell people all you want to say, and they can still choose to not listen, or take whatever they want in a different way. And again, it comes right back to your message of choice. So we can all learn this great lesson of you have a choice, but at the end of the day, what are we choosing to do? So the answer lies in the question. It depends on what you want to do in the first place. So now I have this interesting question that I saw. And I also started thinking about it as well when you talk about trauma and other things. So we have difficult situations in life. And then we also have sometimes a physical ailment that stops us from doing things that we enjoy. And there comes this interesting question of, when it comes to choice, it's a bit different. If it's a situation we're dealing with, and it's just like, day-to-day choice versus, okay, this is an ailment, it could be an injury or, a physical barrier to kind of keep you from doing things. An example is I have this friend who's currently going through something really traumatic that just happened last year. I don't know the name of the condition, but essentially she cannot eat anything processed and has to cut out everything that she loves from her diet. And in a way, it kind of helps because, she only eats really organic and good food, doesn't really use anything that is like let's just say any sauces that might be questionable in terms of where they come from. But it's kind of challenging as well when you think about it from a perspective of someone that really loves food. And this is creating a lot of psychological stress in her life. And this is like a condition with her physical health. And she's trying and trying and trying to see different physicians and doctors to kind of help her with this, including nutritionists as well. Still not really improving. And, it's impacting all aspects of her life. And so when I think about her, I think about these different people that might have similar, physical health issues. And because of these physical health issues, they have psychological barriers as to what they can do in life or, how they are enjoying their lives as well. So, how can naturopathy helps with this? How can addressing physical health issues help people with, overcoming their psychological barriers in life?
Well, there's an interesting concept in naturopathic medicine about organ function and the impact of organ function on psychological health. And so an example would be there's an anecdotal relationship between depression and the liver. And so sometimes if the liver is sluggish, it can create what we call a liver kind of depression, which differs in contrast with depression that's associated with heart function, right? And so you can get the same net psychological effect from different organs. And that's where it kind of becomes a little bit of an art with medicine of understanding, okay, well, where in the physical body is this actually originating from? And so all depression, just to apply this, it can't be treated equally there because there might be something going on in the body in a different location between people. So if we just give antidepressant drugs, it's not really doing much, right, for the underlying cause. So that's an idea that it's kind of floating around naturopathic medicine and Chinese medicine as well, which looks at more of a very holistic view of the body. But I also want to add is that whenever our bodies are telling us something, in the case of your friend, she's not able to eat certain foods, what we do, the first thing that we do when we get sick is often reject everything, saying that I shouldn't be sick, this isn't right, this is not my fault, and we kind of push all the responsibility away from us, and there's personal responsibility again. But I think what's huge is submitting to that process of what is my body trying to tell me by telling me that, okay, I don't want you to eat these foods. What's the reason, right? Because it's not doing that for no reason. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused. They think it's just like some faulty mechanism and the body is kind of dumb. It doesn't have intelligence. It's just saying, oh, you can't have this food. I'm going to torture you. That's not really what it's doing. I believe that the body is intelligent. And one of the ways we know that is because of when we cut our finger, it knows how to heal itself, right? We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to heal somebody's chronic disease, right? We can't do it with drugs. The person's body can do it if it's given the right circumstances. So I think when you get sick, instead of fighting everything and saying, I want to kill this and I want to destroy that and I want to get rid of all this, just submit to what your body is trying to tell you, because you're going to gain a completely different perspective about why that's happening to you. And you'll actually find answers too. But you won't find answers unless you ask the question, unless you submit to that something is happening it's obviously beyond my control right now, but there's a reason for this. And what is that reason?
Yeah, I think that's profound though, because when you're dealing with a physical ailment, it's kind of like, oh, I just want this to be over. I just want to get well. And, like when you're not well after, let's say you have a fever, like after a week, you're already frustrated, right? If it goes on to the second week, let alone something that lasts for years, it can cause a lot of frustration. But yeah, I reflect back on my friend's example. And based on what you were saying, it's kind of like, she's probably, this is a good opportunity for her to learn about her body functions and, what kind of food she should eat.
Exactly.
And in fact, I stayed with her for a bit when I visited her in Sydney, and we ate the same food. So I was trying to support her from on her healing journey, because she can only eat like all the natural ingredients. And I found that it's really hard, given how much temptation we have around us, and all this amazing food outside. But we cooked at home, and it was actually quite yum. It's still
Man,
like everything was still good. And so I thought about this, because it's kind of like she's eating this diet from probably 100 years ago, before all the processed food we have now came to be. And it's not that bad, because if humans could live with such food a long time ago, then we can now. It's just that it's so hard for her, given what she has tried before and all this temptation. At the same time, this is an interesting opportunity for her to learn about the body function, and it's probably going to create a new purpose in life for her to help other people like herself to overcome this situation. So it's
isn't
quite
that beautiful?
fascinating. It is, because she was talking to me about it. She was like, oh, maybe I'll become a nutritionist, because I've learned so much through my illness.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is.
She might go through an evolution because of what her symptoms are. And that's why I tell people, just submit to it. Just listen to what it is, because you're going to spend all these months and years fighting it. And what's going to happen? It's just going to keep fighting you back. But if you just submit, then you'll understand, okay, there's something here. And you may even experience an evolution as a person.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's what I'm kind of seeing for her. But of course, she's the one that's going through all of this. So I cannot just say, hey, Rach, it's going to be fine. Everything will work out just fine for you. It's hard for the person going through this to see it themselves. So I'm hoping it'll be something positive that comes out of this whole process. But yeah, it's not to discount, the different types of physical ailments that people have to go through, and sometimes this this happens out of choice, right? They didn't choose to be unwell or go through certain things. So it's also a message of empathy for them too. There's that sense of choice that you mentioned, which I totally agree with, but there's also perspective. So for friends and families, or outside people looking in, it's good to have that sense of perspective too.
Sometimes you don't know that you're making the wrong choice for yourself. I think that's where the trouble is. And you're not going to know that until you make choices and then see what the effect is, right? And when it comes to food, if you're going to eat processed foods every day, I think at this point we know that that's probably going to result in some kind of health problem. But if you don't know that, then you don't know any better, right? So you don't know there's a better choice that you can make, but your body might tell you, because your body knows, right? You don't know, but your body knows. And that's that inherent wisdom again, that intelligence. And it's going to tell you in its own language, which is, by the way, symptoms, unfortunately. Here's a bunch of symptoms. I don't like what you're doing. And it's part of your job now to listen to that little intuitive voice that's saying, I think it's probably from this. And I'll even ask people directly when they come in, why do you think you're sick? What's the reason? And people usually have an answer. They usually have an understanding of that already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I think we've covered quite a bit on the topic of learned helplessness, naturopathy, and some other aspects of happiness and choices in life. So for our audience today, I'm sure they would like to take home something with them that they can practice. So we have this section called Practices and Habits, and I would love to ask you to share a practice with us on this topic. So let's say somebody who's listening to this conversation might be going through a tough time. They might probably have a sense that, okay, I have this learned helplessness in my life. I want to overcome it. What would be a practice that you do yourself, or a practice that you would recommend to them, so that they can try maybe every day or every week to have a happier life?
Yeah. I think self-observation would be the practice. Getting outside of your the subjective view that you have of yourself. Now, you're never going to fully escape being a subject, right? That's the nature of life. But if you can sort of take an approach where, almost as if you're studying an insect, where you're just sort of watching the insect move, where it's going, what it's doing, but you're not involved in any of that insect's life, right? You have no idea what it's really doing. It's just sort of doing things, and you're observing that. Maybe you're watching the ant march its way back to its colony, do all these strange things that it does, and you're saying, okay, and you're sort of taking notes on that. If you can look at yourself that way, without judging yourself, without criticizing yourself, just observing yourself and observing what comes up. It's often something that's recommended during meditation practice, but you can do it every day. You can do it in your social interactions. You can do it while you're eating. You can do all these things, just observing yourself, and particularly your responses to your day-to-day affairs. In that, you can learn about what causes you to have certain reactions. And when you do that, you can also start tracing that back and saying, okay, I had a reaction. I didn't want to have that reaction, or didn't want to do that response. Why did I do that? And then you start playing some games with yourself of, okay, why did that happen? Start tracing that back. And then you find a belief system, an old belief system. And you say, oh yeah, when I was 14, I was traumatized by this certain event. And now that's causing me to make these decisions. So if you keep following those threads back by starting with self-observation, you'll start to find these weeds that you can pull out of things that you don't need to be there anymore. I don't have to be criticizing myself. Why am I doing that constantly? Oh, because I feel inadequate. Well, why do I feel inadequate? Because the environment that I was raised in was very critical. Okay, that environment doesn't exist anymore. So now I'm just propagating it with my own choices. And so if you come back to self-observation, it's going to inevitably lead you back to those belief systems. And then you can change them. That's the great part about it, is you can change them to whatever you want. And that's what life becomes fun at that point. You realize that you're in control after all.
Yeah. I think it is fun. Considering, I like to say it, considering yourself your own project, and that self-observation practice is probably part of that. It's terrifying though. It's kind of like you have to look at look at the fact that you are the problem, and acknowledge where you make the mistakes, or where you actually should change. And change is scary because it's sometimes learned helplessness can be enjoyable because you're just in that space of like, oh, I'm just comfortable knowing that I'm not the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine, right? And I'm not. I don't want anyone to think that the way that I'm proposing, all these things I'm proposing, is a better way. It's not a better way. It's just a different way. It's another way of looking at things. It's a way that I found that's worked for me personally. It's a way that I found that's helped many patients also who really understand the teaching. But it's not a better way. It's just a different way of looking at it. And it might be more comfortable for you to look at things this way. It may result in personality changes, or it may not work for you. So it's just another way of looking at things that you may or may not choose to experiment and play with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's good because I like that as well, in the sense that I can look at my own personal experience, and I've shared this on the show already, and to our audience who are kind of in doubt, I can confirm. Of course, I'm not going to discount different challenges and situations, because the magnitude of the problem for each person would be different depending on what the problems are. But an example I can give you is I was going through a period of severe burnout, and I knew exactly why it was. And I was sitting in it for months, to kind of like that sense of learned helplessness. And, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just burnt out. I'm not enjoying anything. And then one day I was like, you know what? I'm kind of sick of being burnt out and, just low energy all the time. So I'm just going to decide today that I'm going to be high energy and, change how I see this whole situation. And then I start going to the gym. That completely changed my life. Even though it's like something so simple, just going to the gym, right? It's nothing like, oh, like this is like you entering a competition or anything that is sounding so fancy. It's just one day I decided to sign up to the gym, and that changed my life. And actually going to the gym, not just signing up. But yeah, that's one personal example I can share.
So it's a great story, and I think that it really encapsulates a lot of what we talked about. Is sometimes you're gonna literally get sick of being in that state, right? You're getting sick of being sick. It's kind of weird to say, but then you decide, okay, I don't want to be sick anymore, and that's when a lot of people start looking for anything that can help them, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to also add in that I know we're approaching the end here, that I have a deep respect and love for humanity in general, and everything that I do as a part of who I am, it comes from a place of wanting to help people and wanting the best for them. And I think that some of my teachings can really benefit people. And, again, I don't see them as any better than anything else. I don't see myself as better than anyone else, just different. And I think that the more we share our perspectives from a place of positive intention, the more we can change and grow as people. And I think that's a good thing for all of us if we can evolve to a more healthier mindset as a collective. So I just wanted to throw that in at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually still have open mic. So
okay, good. So it's not the end.
It's not the end yet, but I love that message to close out the practice part, because, any practice is a choice. Again, I think it's good intention that you're recommending the practice of self-observation. Is nothing to critique anybody, because at the end of the day, we are the only ones that know if we're the problem or where the problem is. So now let's go into your open mic, Jared. This is your chance to talk about anything else that we didn't get to cover, or anything that you're passionate about that you would like to share with our audience. So take it away.
I'm going to be boring and say that health is my primary passion in life. It really is, though. To me, it's life in general. Life is health, the same thing to me. But I really love nature too, and I think that I think people should endeavor to get out more into nature, and really just sit in nature, and be in your own energy, because some of the mysteries of life start unwinding themselves to you, and that's when you start to get that sense of inspiration and that creativity that comes in, and that sense of awe for life. And it really just revitalizes and reinvigorates you. And it's encouraging. We're always thinking about, well, maybe not always, but we think about at times, why am I here? And what's my purpose in life? And I think that your purpose in life is whatever you want it to be, right? Again, it's a choice again. But that's so freeing though, right? Because you have such power over your life, and you can actually co-create your reality with other people. And I think that if we go out into nature, we'll naturally start to get to that mindset of, I'm really powerful, and I can actually do more than I thought I can, and I can influence more in ways that more than I thought I could. So getting out into nature is a way that I go and find my own energy again and establish a sense of connection with the world. And that's where I'm reinvigorated for my love of life, and my love of people, and my love of health, and pretty much everything, right? It cultivates that love mindset, I suppose. And that's where everything starts to connect. So getting out into nature will cultivate a love mindset, which will cultivate better health for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the beautiful message that we're closing our podcast with today. And if our audience would like to find out more about your work or get in touch, where should they go?
Just hop over to my website, drpistoia.com. If you're interested in, I have 2 books. So if you're interested in the Pocket Full of Sunshine, the book about depression, that's on Barnes & Noble at the website. And I also have another book called In Pursuit of Health that talks more broadly about health and healthcare, particularly in the United States, and why alternative medicine is sort of this like background player and not a forerunner. And actually, you had mentioned something earlier about if we knew about these techniques earlier, we'd be a lot better off. We did. These are the techniques that we started with, and we actually were doing really well for a while with these techniques. But that's sort of what my book is about. It In Pursuit of Health is why it shifted and why we are where we are. So that's on the Barnes & Noble website.
Interesting. And thank you for sharing.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.